The room was designed to impress: glass walls, muted lights, long table polished to reflect confidence. $72 million sat quietly behind the slides, not as numbers, but as expectation. I had delivered versions of this pitch for decades, calmly, precisely, without theatrics. The client leaned forward, attentive, pen resting, eyes fixed on the logic unfolding. This was familiar territory for me, the place where experience speaks without effort and preparation replaces noise. At that moment, nothing felt unstable. Everything felt earned. I was midway through a sentence explaining risk mitigation when movement shifted beside me. A hand lifted slightly, not urgently, not aggressively. The interruption came as a courtesy wrapped in authority. "We should pause here," was said with a neutral smile. No reason given. No explanation offered. The room went still in a way that seasoned professionals recognize immediately. Security appeared without urgency, as if rehearsed. My badge was requested quietly. The screen behind me froze on a slide. No one was reading anymore. I did not resist. I did not ask questions. Years in leadership teach you when a moment is no longer about argument but about observation. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A senior executive avoided eye contact while another stared too intently at the table. The client noticed all of it. People underestimate how much seasoned buyers read the room beyond the presentation. They measure respect, stability, and self-control. Being removed without explanation during a major pitch speaks louder than any slide. It reveals culture instantly and without correction. As I gathered my materials, I felt no anger, only clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision rehearsed long before that morning. The calmness of it confirmed that. I nodded once, thanked no one, and walked out slowly. Behind me, the meeting resumed awkwardly. Voices attempted to recover momentum, but the rhythm was gone. Experience teaches you that credibility, once fractured, does not heal inside the same conversation. The client was no longer evaluating a proposal. They were evaluating judgment, leadership maturity, and how power was exercised under pressure. What many never realize is that clients remember moments like this longer than results. They remember who was silenced and who allowed it. As I reached the hallway, I understood something with absolute certainty. The wrong people had witnessed the wrong behavior. Reputation is not built during success alone. It is revealed during discomfort. The silence in that room carried weight, and the client carried it with them. I did not need to explain myself. The story had already been told without my participation. Only later would the significance settle fully. This was not a firing that ended a career. It was an exposure that began another chapter. Experience teaches patience, and patience teaches timing. I did not rush to justify or react. I left knowing that authority does not belong to whoever speaks last, but to whoever is believed when silence follows. That day ended quietly, but its consequences were already moving. Somewhere behind those glass walls, confidence had cracked. Somewhere across the table, respect had shifted direction. And I knew, without doubt, that this decision would return to them in ways no spreadsheet could measure. For professionals who have lived long enough to see cycles repeat, moments like this are unmistakable. They mark the instant when power moves quietly from institution to individual, from title to trust, from noise to consequence, and nothing afterward unfolds by accident. That understanding is what separates experience from ambition and explains why some endings become beginnings long after rooms fall silent and doors. The door had barely closed behind me before the room attempted to resume its rhythm. Slides moved forward, voices rearranged themselves, and someone at the far end of the table attempted a light remark meant to smooth the interruption. It landed without effect. Everyone heard it, yet no one responded with genuine ease. People who have spent years in boardrooms understand this kind of discomfort. It is the silence that follows an event the group has agreed to ignore. The executives tried to behave as though nothing unusual had happened, but their eyes betrayed an unsettled awareness. The client noticed the shift immediately. Their pen, active moments ago, now rested flat on the table. They leaned back slightly, observing the faces around them with the patience of someone accustomed to reading more than what is spoken. They were no longer tracking figures or timelines. They were studying the people who claimed to lead the project. This adjustment in attention happened quietly yet decisively. Social intelligence develops with experience, and the client possessed enough of it to recognize when a team loses its center. My removal had not just disrupted the presentation. It had revealed a hierarchy built on insecurity. Inside the room, the executives tried to regain control. One tapped his finger against the table in an attempt to redirect attention to the slide. Another cleared his throat with the hope that a firm tone might restore authority. These gestures felt practiced but empty. Clients who have spent years navigating corporate landscapes can sense when leadership strains to appear composed. What should have been a seamless continuation became a sequence of forced transitions that drew attention to the very moment everyone wished to erase. The more they pushed forward, the more apparent the absence of equilibrium became. The client shifted again, this time crossing their arms and narrowing their focus on the executive now speaking. It was not a gesture of hostility, but of measurement. They were calculating something that had nothing to do with budgets. Stability matters as much as innovation in high-stakes environments, and the client was no longer convinced they were witnessing either. The room carried the faint tension that emerges when people pretend a narrative is still intact even as every instinct confirms that it is fractured. The presentation continued, but the purpose had quietly changed from persuasion to observation. By the time the next section of the proposal appeared on the screen, the executives had begun to speak faster. They hoped momentum would mask uncertainty. However, seasoned clients recognized the difference between confidence and acceleration. The more the executives attempted to regain authority, the further it slipped from their grasp. The client directed fewer glances at the data and more at the faces presenting it. They were drawing conclusions not from the content, but from the conduct. A meeting intended to highlight innovation now revealed imbalance, and the executives could not contain the shift. Clients with long professional histories understand that trust is tested during moments like these. What happened to me had become secondary. The real subject of the meeting was now the character of the organization that had removed a key contributor without context. The client evaluated not the proposal, but the culture behind it. They examined how leaders treated their own people and how quickly a room unraveled when stability left it. While the executives pushed through the final slides, the client had already reached a quiet verdict. They had seen enough to know that something essential had been exposed. Its impact would unfold far more powerfully than anyone anticipated today. The hours that followed the meeting gave me time to reflect on something I learned long before titles and budgets became part of my routine. Clients with real influence do not commit to partnerships because of numbers alone. Numbers convince the eye, but trust convinces the mind. That room had been filled with charts, projections, and carefully crafted arguments, yet none of it mattered as much as the human element the executives underestimated. They believed the success of the pitch depended on rehearsed content. The client believed it depended on the person who knew how to carry the vision without needing to announce it. Leadership is often misunderstood by those who only see authority as a position rather than a presence. What the client saw that morning was not a technical interruption. They saw a team remove the one person who had been guiding the conversation with calm assurance. Before the moment I was asked to step out, the flow of the room had been grounded. The questions had direction. The tone remained stable. When you spend decades presenting high-stakes proposals, you begin to understand that ownership of a space is not about volume, but about steadiness. A client can feel when someone knows the material in depth rather than in memorized fragments. That difference is sensed long before any contract is signed. The client noticed that shift immediately. While management focused on the slides, they failed to recognize how their own behavior affected the atmosphere. When I spoke, the room moved with purpose, not because I demanded it, but because understanding naturally invites attention. The client recognized who held the thread of the conversation and who followed it without confidence. Experience teaches you to read beyond the content. You watch who listens, who hesitates, and who contributes with genuine clarity. The executives misread the silence in the room. They assumed it came from respect for their authority. The client knew it came from the expectation that the person leading the pitch would continue to do so. Clients do not make $50 or $70 million decisions based on a document alone. They evaluate whether the team presenting it understands the underlying risks and long-term responsibilities. The person who carries the knowledge is the one who explains without rushing, who answers without searching, and who anticipates concerns before they surface. The interruption revealed exactly who that person was and who it was not. What management thought was a simple personnel adjustment became a statement about their internal judgment. In trying to assert control, they exposed a lack of awareness that no slide could correct. The client saw the imbalance clearly. They saw a team that relied on the preparation of one individual, yet attempted to proceed without acknowledging the contribution. They saw an organization that valued hierarchy over competence. Most importantly, they saw what was missing the moment I left the room. A presentation that once had direction dissolved into fragments. Instead of guiding the conversation, the executives reacted to it. Clients who have managed complex projects recognize this shift instantly. It signals that the true architect is no longer present. What management missed was that credibility is not transferable. You cannot remove someone mid-sentence and expect the authority they carried to remain behind. The client understood this long before the executives realized the magnitude of their decision. They had come to evaluate a proposal, but they left evaluating character. And in their assessment, the wrong person had been dismissed while the wrong people remained in charge. Experience has taught me that clients rarely say this aloud. They simply make their choices quietly, decisively, and in ways that reshape the future of everyone involved. The walk from the conference room to the elevator felt longer than it ever had, not because of the distance, but because of what I carried with me. My badge was gone. My access had been removed. The office I had occupied for years was now a space I would not see again. There was no title attached to my name any longer, no department waiting for direction, no assistant coordinating the rest of my day. I stepped into the hallway with empty hands, yet the absence of material things made something else unexpectedly clear. What I still possessed could not be packed into a box or locked behind a glass door. Reputation travels with you even when everything else is taken away. Outside the building, the air felt colder, sharp in a way that forces clarity upon you. People hurried past with their own concerns, unaware of how drastically my world had shifted in the last minutes. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the transition settle. Losing a title is often described as a fall, but experience teaches you that titles are temporary positions given by others. Reputation is the work you carry inside you, built through years of consistency, resilience, and integrity. No organization can confiscate that. It is earned, not assigned. As I walked toward the street, I thought about the countless mornings I had started in that building. The early arrivals, the late evenings, the quiet hours spent solving problems no one else wanted to touch. None of that disappeared because someone decided a younger voice should take the seat. Older professionals understand this truth deeply. You are not defined by the role you hold, but by the competence you demonstrate. What matters most is the trust others have learned to place in you over time. That kind of trust does not vanish when a badge is turned in. Standing at the curb, I felt no panic. There was uncertainty, yes, but not fear. I had lived long enough to know that careers do not end with closed doors. They evolve. When you have built a reputation brick by brick through decades of steady work, you do not leave a company empty. You take with you the confidence of knowing what you can do and the understanding of who respects it. I realized that although I no longer had a desk, I still had something far more valuable. I had the respect of clients, colleagues, and partners who had seen my work long before titles existed. As I waited for a car, I replayed the expression on the client's face when I was interrupted. It was not confusion. It was recognition. They had seen enough to understand that the person leaving the room was taking the substance of the pitch with him. What remained behind was structure, without stability. That moment mattered far more than any slide or statistic. Clients remember who provides clarity. They remember who steps forward when others hesitate. They remember who knows the material from years of experience rather than from a script. These memories follow a person long after contracts expire. The ride home offered time to breathe. I looked out the window at familiar streets, aware that a chapter had closed but not sensing defeat. Instead, I felt a quiet acceptance that comes only with age. When younger professionals lose a job, they often feel as though everything has been taken from them. When older professionals face the same event, they understand that nothing essential has been lost. You cannot remove a person's history. You cannot erase the relationships they have built. You cannot replace the wisdom they have earned. Reputation is not tied to a building. By the time I stepped through my front door, the shock of the day had softened. I sat down and realized something profound. I had walked out with no title, no office, and no contract. Yet I had walked out with something infinitely more influential. I still had my name. And in the world of long careers, a respected name is the one thing that does not belong to any employer. It belongs only to the person who earned it. The house was unusually quiet that afternoon. I had returned home earlier than anyone expected, and the stillness carried a weight that invited reflection. I placed my belongings on the table, items that no longer belonged to any office. The hours passed slowly, each one filled with the unsettled calm that follows a sudden change. I reviewed nothing. I planned nothing. I simply allowed the day to unfold without forcing meaning onto it. Experience has taught me that important moments rarely arrive with noise. They arrive in the pauses we do not anticipate. The sun was beginning to set when the phone finally rang. I expected the number on the screen to belong to someone from the company, perhaps a carefully worded attempt to soften the morning's events. It was not HR. It was not legal. It was not any internal line. The name glowing on the display stopped me instantly. It was the client. The same client who had watched my removal. The same client who had followed every shift in the room with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating more than presentations. I answered without hesitation, although I had no idea what they intended to say. There was no introduction. No pleasantries. Only a calm voice speaking with the clarity of someone who had already reached a decision. They asked a single question that carried more weight than any contract my former company had ever placed in front of them. Are you available to finish the conversation somewhere else? That moment held a kind of silence that does not come from confusion. It comes from recognition. The question was not about a meeting. It was about trust. It was about continuity. It was about who they believed held the true insight behind the proposal and who they believed had disrupted it. I sat there for several seconds before answering, not because I was uncertain, but because the simplicity of the request revealed something far greater than an invitation. The balance of power had shifted without noise, without confrontation, and without strategy. It had shifted because credibility is not created in a single presentation. It is accumulated over years through steadiness, accuracy, and consistency. What the executives had tried to remove in a moment could not be removed at all. The client had seen who carried the knowledge, and their response was decisive. When I finally replied, my voice was steady, shaped by the kind of composure that grows only with age. I told them I was available. They proposed a time and a location, not for a formal pitch, but for a direct continuation of the conversation I had been cut off from earlier. They did not ask for the company. They did not ask for any executive. They asked only for me. The call lasted less than a minute, yet it reshaped the meaning of the entire day. Losing a position had made room for something far more consequential. After the conversation ended, I remained seated, letting the reality sink in. The company had removed me without understanding what I represented. The client, however, had no doubt. They valued consistency more than hierarchy, trust more than theatrics, and depth more than authority. Older professionals understand this instinctively because time teaches us what truly influences long-term decisions. The call was not an act of sympathy. It was an act of alignment. They chose to follow the person who had earned their confidence long before any interruption. As evening settled across the room, I realized something profound. I had walked out of a building with nothing but my name. Now that name had become the one thing the client insisted on. The power had not disappeared. It had simply changed location. And for the first time that day, I understood that the story ahead would unfold on terms that were no longer dictated by anyone else. The meeting with the client took place the following afternoon in a quiet private room of a hotel, far removed from the atmosphere of the boardroom where everything had unraveled. There were no screens, No documents spread across a table, no assistants waiting nearby. The client arrived with a folder tucked under one arm, but placed it aside immediately. They were not here to discuss numbers. They were here to address something far more important. When people have spent decades managing large investments, they learn that financial decisions are built on human assessments long before they are built on spreadsheets. They began by revisiting the moment I had been interrupted. They described it with an accuracy that surprised me. They remembered the shift in the room, the sudden discomfort among the executives, the forced continuity that followed. They recalled the absence of explanation and the disregard shown not only to me but to the structure of the presentation itself. They explained that the problem was not the interruption alone. The problem was the message it revealed about the organization. A company willing to dismiss one of its own experts in the middle of a major negotiation demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of partnership and respect. The client leaned back and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had guided enormous projects through unpredictable environments. They explained that they had no interest in investing with a leadership team that undermined its own stability. They had seen examples of this throughout their career, and every time it led to consequences far more damaging than the initial mistake. When people in authority humiliate those they rely on, trust erodes quietly at first and then collapses without warning. They told me that the executives had shown their culture, and once a culture reveals itself, it cannot be unseen. They continued by saying that the interruption had not embarrassed me. It had embarrassed the company. The executives had attempted to project control, but what they actually projected was insecurity. The client explained that seasoned investors evaluate how individuals treat the people who hold real knowledge. Experts, they said, are the backbone of every long-term contract. They carry the skills, the memory, the continuity that projects of this scale require. When leadership fails to protect its experts, it fails to protect the investment itself. This was why they were pulling the $72 million deal. They made it clear that anger played no role in their decision. They insisted that walking away was not an emotional reaction. It was the result of clarity gained in a single defining moment. They had spent years working with organizations that claimed to value experience while quietly undermining it. They had witnessed projects collapse because leadership prioritized pride over prudence. They refused to repeat that pattern. Their decision was, in their words, an act of responsibility. They were choosing long-term stability over short-term convenience. As they spoke, I understood that the loss of the contract meant something very different to them than it did to my former company. For the executives, it would be a financial setback. For the client, it was a demonstration of principle. They valued consistency, respect, and the preservation of knowledge. They believed that an organization reveals more about itself in a moment of tension than in years of smooth operations. The interruption had been brief, but it had exposed enough for them to redraw the future of their partnership. When the conversation came to a close, the client stood and extended a hand. They told me they would not reconsider their decision, and they would not speak with the executives again. They were choosing a different path, not out of frustration, but out of conviction. I left the room with a clear understanding of what had happened. The deal had not collapsed. It had been withdrawn with intention. In that moment, the company lost more than money. They lost the trust of someone who had seen leadership fail too many times to tolerate it again. The days following the collapse of the deal unfolded in a quiet rhythm. There was no impulse to announce what had happened, no temptation to expose the company, and no desire to turn the experience into a spectacle. Years of professional life teach you that dignity is not loud and wisdom is not rushed. Instead of reacting publicly, I allowed the silence to settle. My phone remained on the table, unused except for the occasional message from former colleagues who had heard whispers of the event, but did not know how to approach it. I did not respond to all of them. Some conversations can wait until clarity forms. During those first days, I made no plans for revenge. I felt no need to reclaim anything through force or anger. The company had made its choice, and the consequences of that decision were already unfolding without my involvement. My energy went not into looking backward, but into deciding how I wanted the next chapter of my professional life to take shape. For the first time in years, I sat down with a blank sheet of paper and examined what I wanted rather than what I had been obligated to manage. The idea of forming a new company arrived without drama. It emerged naturally as I considered the skills I had accumulated and the confidence I still possessed. I did not imagine starting small because I did not view myself as someone beginning from nothing. Experience is not erased by circumstance. It remains intact, ready to be used wherever it is welcomed. I filed the necessary documents quietly, spoke with a few trusted advisors, and structured the new business with the simplicity that comes from knowing exactly what works and what does not. There were no announcements, no marketing campaigns, no declarations of reinvention. The foundation was built in silence because silence offers stability. I did not chase clients. I knew that those who understood my value would find me when the time was right. One of the advantages of a long career is the understanding that relationships forged through years of trust do not evaporate the moment a title disappears. They simply wait for the appropriate space to reappear. I created that space by establishing a structure capable of supporting serious commitments. Once the framework was in place, I allowed time to do its work. Patience becomes easier when you are no longer driven by insecurity. As I arranged the new office, a modest room with a single desk and a view of the street, I felt a sense of steadiness returning. I furnished it with care, not to impress visitors, but to create an environment where my thoughts could move freely. Every item had a purpose. Every file had a place. There was no clutter, physical or mental. Starting again does not mean shrinking. It means choosing deliberately. I understood that the first decision many people make after a career setback is to seek validation. I chose stillness instead. The interesting shift came not from what I did, but from what I did not do. I did not call potential clients. I did not request meetings. I did not broadcast my availability. The client who had walked away from the $72 million deal knew how to reach me. Others would follow if they believed in the work rather than the title behind it. Experience teaches you that a reputation built over decades is a stronger invitation than any promotional message. While the world moved at its usual speed, I waited with intention and without anxiety. Late one afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the new office floor, I realized something important. I had not started small. I had started clean. There is a difference. Beginning again, without noise, is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of ownership. The next steps of my career would not depend on urgency or persuasion. They would depend on readiness. And I was ready. The news arrived quietly, just as most important moments tend to do. I was seated in my new office, reviewing the structure of the operational plan I intended to implement once the first opportunity appeared. The room was simple, furnished with intention rather than display, a space built for clarity rather than performance. I was not expecting visitors. I was not expecting calls. The early stages of a new company often unfold in silence, and I had grown comfortable with that pace. Midway through the afternoon, my phone lit up with the name of the client who had witnessed the events of the previous week. I answered with calm curiosity, unaware that this call would reshape everything that followed. The conversation opened without hesitation. They informed me that they had completed their internal review of the abandoned project. The content had not been the problem. The leadership had. They explained that after observing how the company had handled the presentation, they could no longer trust them with an initiative of such scale. The project required stability, continuity, and a level of expertise that could not be replaced through hierarchy alone. They had followed my departure closely and confirmed that my new company had completed its registration. Then they stated, with careful clarity, that they wished to resume the project under my name. There was no negotiation. They offered the same budget, the same scope, and the same timeline. The only difference was the absence of the logo that had once overshadowed the work. I listened in silence, understanding the significance of what they were saying. The $72 million contract was not returning to its original home. It was moving forward with the person they trusted rather than the institution that had dismissed him. The client explained that competence is the foundation of every long-term partnership. A logo may offer visibility, but visibility is meaningless when the work behind it lacks integrity. Authority follows competence, and competence follows the individual who demonstrates it consistently. We arranged a meeting for the following morning to finalize the agreement. When the client arrived, they carried a confidence that reflected their decision. They stepped into the office, took a slow look around, and smiled. The space was modest, yet something about its simplicity seemed to reassure them. It represented the beginning of a partnership built on substance rather than status. They handed me the documents without ceremony. Their gesture was not theatrical. It was decisive. They were placing the future of the project into hands they believed had earned the right to guide it. As we reviewed the terms, they explained that this transition was not an experiment. It was a correction. They had observed the way I handled pressure, the steadiness of my communication, and the clarity of my responses during the original meeting. They had also observed the behavior of the executives after my departure. To them, the choice had been obvious. Trust does not come from titles. It comes from the presence of someone who understands the work deeply enough to carry it forward without hesitation. They needed continuity, and continuity is always found in the person who knows the material, not in the company that claims ownership of it. When the contract was signed, I felt no triumph. I felt recognition. The project had returned not because of revenge or strategy, but because the client valued competence over corporate image. The transfer of authority was quiet, almost graceful. Nothing needed to be said about the company I had left. Their absence spoke for them. The client gathered their materials, thanked me for my readiness, and walked out with the assurance of someone who had made a sound decision. After they left, I sat alone in the office for a moment. The room felt different now, heavier with responsibility, yet lighter in purpose. I realized that the beginning of my new company had been marked by more than a first contract. It had been marked by proof. Proof that the work we do across a lifetime does not disappear when a title is taken away. Proof that people follow consistency over reputation and character over corporate identity. Proof that authority is carried, not assigned. And that day it followed me. The first contract had barely settled into place when the next development unfolded. I was in the middle of organizing the project timeline, quietly adjusting the structure to fit the resources of a young company when the client requested another meeting. Their tone did not suggest a problem. It suggested intent. We met in the same private room as before, a space that had already become a symbol of transition. They arrived with the air of someone carrying more than paperwork. Something about their confidence that morning hinted that the story was no longer limited to a single recovered deal. After a brief exchange, they leaned forward and explained that they had spoken about the project at a recent industry gathering. Not in a formal panel or a scheduled presentation, but in small conversations with peers who manage significant portfolios. They recounted the incident at the boardroom with a measured clarity, not focusing on drama but on the principles that guided their decision. They mentioned the interruption, the uneasy silence, and the lack of leadership displayed by the company that had dismissed me. What surprised me was not that they discussed the event. It was how others reacted to it. The client then introduced the first new name, a respected figure in the sector, known for handling complex initiatives requiring precision and foresight. They had been searching for someone capable of guiding a project similar in scale to the one already entrusted to me. The client had recommended my name with a single sentence. He is the one who understands the space. No slide deck had been sent. No formal pitch had been prepared. Trust had traveled faster than presentation materials ever could. Before I could process this, the client introduced the second name. This individual managed a portfolio spread across international markets and had expressed frustration with consultants who offered style without substance. According to the client, they had responded immediately to the recommendation. They were willing to schedule a meeting without reviewing any promotional materials. They requested only a conversation. The simplicity of the request revealed something profound. When credibility exists, the need for persuasion disappears. The third introduction came with a slower, almost deliberate pace. This final contact was considered one of the most selective figures in the field, someone who rarely shifted partners unless there was a compelling reason. The client explained that after hearing the story of the disrupted pitch and the manner in which the company had handled it, this individual insisted on being included in the introductions. They wanted to understand why a person removed mid-sentence could still command such strong support. The client had given them the same explanation. He is the one who understands this space. The room felt different as the weight of those words settled. 3 potential clients, each with influential roles, were ready to engage with a company that had existed for only weeks. Not because of branding, not because of visibility, not because of a polished marketing campaign. They were willing to move forward because reputation earned over decades does not vanish when you walk away from an office building. It follows you into every room you enter, even the ones you are not expecting. As the introductions were finalized, I felt a quiet validation that only comes later in life. Younger professionals often chase recognition. Older professionals understand that consistency becomes recognition. The work performed across decades speaks long after titles expire. These 3 clients did not see a new company. They saw continuity. They saw someone who had held the fabric of complex operations together until one decision had attempted to sever it. They recognized that stability does not live in structures. It lives in people. When the client stood to leave, they repeated the same sentence once more, almost as a closing note. He is the one who understands the space. After they left, I remained seated, absorbing the significance of what had just unfolded. It was not luck. It was not strategy. It was the result of years of steady work finally being allowed to speak without interruption. The news reached them slowly at first, almost as background noise carried from one department to another. A former colleague heard that the client had withdrawn the $72 million project entirely. Another learned that the client had scheduled a private follow-up meeting, one that did not involve any members of the company. For several days, fragments of information circulated through internal channels until the truth became too large to ignore. The project had not vanished. It had simply changed direction. And the direction pointed toward the name they had dismissed so easily. The first call came from a senior executive who had remained silent during the incident in the boardroom. His message was brief. He wanted to discuss the situation. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the moment he had watched without intervention, no sign of awareness that the decision they had made had revealed more about them than about me. I let the call go unanswered. Some conversations are unnecessary when outcomes have already delivered the response. Several days later, another message arrived. This time from someone who had once prided himself on his strategic instincts. He wrote that he was confused by the client's decision and wanted clarity about what had happened. His confusion revealed more than he intended. People who understand leadership do not need explanations for the consequences of their own actions. They recognize the patterns within them. His request showed that he still believed decisions could be undone if they were interpreted correctly. I replied politely, offering nothing beyond a brief acknowledgement. I provided no insight. Results had already provided the only explanation required. As the weeks progressed, the company began to feel the impact of the lost contract. Delays surfaced. Planned expansions were paused. Investors asked questions that the executives struggled to answer convincingly. The absence of the $72 million project created a hole in their forecasts that no amount of optimism could fill. More importantly, clients and partners noticed the shift. They followed the movement of the contract, quietly comparing the decisions of the company with the choices made by those who controlled the budget. In corporate environments, reputation travels through quiet channels, not formal announcements. Another executive reached out. She had always been cautious, rarely taking a position unless the outcome was guaranteed. Her message was more direct. She wanted to know why the client had chosen to work with me instead of the established organization. She framed the question as if it were a matter of tactics or timing. She could not see that the answer was rooted in something she and her peers had overlooked for years. Clients do not follow logos. They follow competence. They follow stability. They follow the person who can stand in the middle of complexity without losing clarity. I thanked her for reaching out and offered no explanation. In the following weeks, the calls became more frequent. Voices that once carried authority now carried uncertainty. They asked how events had unfolded. They asked whether the client had given me reasons. They asked whether I would consider returning in a consulting capacity. Their inquiries revealed a sudden reversal in perspective. When they removed me, they assumed the structure would remain intact. When the structure weakened, they assumed I would want to return and repair it. They misunderstood both assumptions. I did not provide them with the answers they sought. There was no frustration in my silence, only recognition that explanations were unnecessary. They had witnessed the consequences of their decision. The missing piece of their puzzle was not information. It was humility. A lesson cannot be taught to those who are not ready to acknowledge their role in creating it. As my new company expanded and the additional contracts settled into place, I understood something essential. I had not needed to correct the narrative. I had not needed to defend myself. I had not needed to speak. The outcomes had spoken with more clarity than any argument. And the people who once dismissed me learned their lesson in the quietest, most irrefutable way. In the months that followed, the pace of my work settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. The projects expanded, the meetings multiplied, and the responsibilities grew heavier, yet none of it carried the strain that once accompanied my old position. There was a noticeable difference in the way people approached me. They did not ask for presentations delivered with polished certainty. They asked for guidance. They asked for judgment. They asked for the kind of steady decision-making that only time and experience can cultivate. It was in these quiet interactions that I began to understand the profound shift taking place. I had not been hired. I had been chosen. Being hired is a transaction. It comes with expectations, boundaries, and an unspoken hierarchy. Someone gives permission. Someone grants authority. Someone decides where you fit within a structure built long before you arrive. For years, I lived within that arrangement. I accepted positions, titles, and responsibilities assigned by others. I carried them well, believing that the stability they offered reflected trust. It took my departure from the company to reveal how fragile that belief had been. Titles can be revoked in a sentence. Access can be removed in a moment. Being hired gives you a seat. Being chosen gives you a purpose. I began to reflect on the client who had followed me and on the 3 who had joined them without hesitation. None of them had asked for a pitch deck. None of them had requested an official proposal before meeting. They wanted conversations, clarity, and the reassurance that they were entrusting their resources to someone who understood the terrain from years of navigating it. They valued the familiarity of someone who had weathered enough storms to distinguish urgency from noise. In their presence, I realized that what they sought was not talent alone. They sought continuity. Clients choose people when they see that competence has been earned, not taught. They choose people who know the difference between confidence and arrogance. They choose people who remain steady when the room grows tense and who do not require reassurance to do the work correctly. Looking back, I saw that clients had always come to me with deeper questions than they brought to others. They asked for advice rather than confirmation. They trusted my judgment even when they challenged my conclusions. Trust had been present long before I recognized it. The difference became clear each time a client introduced me to another colleague. They did not describe me by my previous titles. They did not reference the organizations where I had worked. They spoke about how I approached complex information. They spoke about how I listened before responding. They spoke about the stability I maintained during the disrupted presentation that had cost the company its future partnership. They described qualities, not positions. Strengths, not roles. Identity, not employment. It struck me that being chosen comes with a responsibility that is both heavier and more liberating than any job description. Clients who choose you expect more than performance. They expect presence. They expect reliability. They expect a level of integrity that does not shift with circumstance. And in return, they offer something no employer can give. They offer partnership. They offer respect earned through experience rather than granted through authority. They offer loyalty shaped by recognition, not obligation. As I sat in my office one evening, reviewing a set of documents for the next morning's discussion, I felt a sense of gratitude that only comes later in life. All the years of consistency, patience, and measured decision-making had finally spoken for me. Not through promotions. Not through titles. Through the people who chose to place their confidence in my hands. In that moment, I understood why the clients had followed me. Not because they admired my work. Because they trusted it. And trust, once earned over a lifetime, becomes the truest form of being chosen. The signs of trouble at my former company did not appear all at once. They emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, as if the organization was trying to preserve the impression that everything remained under control. The leadership launched several internal initiatives to compensate for the missing contract, but none of them produced meaningful results. Conversations that once flowed with confidence began to feel strained. Even from a distance, I could sense the shift. Large companies rarely collapse in a loud moment. They decline in silence, their structure weakening from the inside long before anyone acknowledges the change. Not long after the loss of the $72 million project, other clients began to reconsider their commitments. Some postponed renewals. Others requested additional meetings to discuss concerns that had not existed before. These hesitations were small on the surface, but they reflected a deeper erosion. When trust begins to fade, the decline is slow but steady. What had once been automatic now required reassurance that leadership could not convincingly provide. Confidence, once lost, rarely returns with ease. Internal reports circulated quietly. Conversations between departments grew tense. Senior executives who once operated with certainty suddenly found themselves defending decisions they had never anticipated explaining. Team members whispered about missed targets and shrinking budgets. People began to leave, not in resignation letters marked with drama, but in silent departures that spoke of diminishing faith. An organization that once carried itself with authority now searched for direction it could not locate. The absence of the contract was more than a financial blow. It was a revelation of how fragile their foundation had always been. I heard through former colleagues that the executives attempted to redesign their pitch strategy. They hired consultants, adjusted proposals, and revisited their messaging. Yet every attempt shared the same flaw. They believed the problem was in the presentation. They could not recognize that the real issue was the culture the client had witnessed. No amount of restructuring could hide the truth that had been exposed in that single meeting. When leadership undermines its own experts, it does not simply weaken a pitch. It weakens the entire organization. The collapse was not visible from the outside in dramatic headlines or public announcements. Instead, it appeared in the steady decline of internal morale. Meetings that once ended with plans began ending with uncertainty. The language of the executives shifted from confidence to caution. They spoke more about stabilizing than advancing. They tried to reassure employees that the situation was manageable, but their uncertainty seeped through every statement. People who have lived long careers understand that organizations rarely admit when the real damage has been done. As months passed, the company attempted small projects to recover momentum, but none of them produced the impact required to reestablish credibility. Prospective clients conducted their own quiet inquiries and learned about the sudden loss of a major deal. They studied the pattern and drew conclusions similar to the original client. They recognized that the problem was not capacity. It was judgment. Trust is a currency far more valuable than revenue, and once depleted, it cannot be restored through aggressive strategies. I observed all of this from a distance, neither celebrating nor interfering. I felt no satisfaction in their struggle. What I felt was confirmation. The outcome aligned with what experience had taught me for years. When an organization loses sight of the value that real professionals bring, the consequences are inevitable. My departure had not caused their decline. It had revealed it. The executives had assumed that removing one person would strengthen their authority. Instead, it exposed their limitations. With time, the company continued operating, but not with the strength it once projected. It functioned differently now, slower, less certain, more reactive than strategic. The quiet collapse behind me served as a reminder of an essential truth. The stability of any organization depends not on its size, but on the respect it shows to those who carry its knowledge. And once that respect is broken, decline begins in silence long before anyone speaks it aloud. If you are listening at this stage of life, allow me to speak to you without pretense. There comes a moment when age is no longer a number on a document, but a lens through which the world begins to judge your relevance. You feel it in meetings where younger voices interrupt without understanding the full picture. You feel it when someone who has not yet lived a quarter of your experience suggests that your way of thinking is outdated. You feel it when the work you carried for years is suddenly treated as weight instead of wisdom. These moments sting, not because they diminish your capacity, but because they reveal how quickly institutions forget who built their stability. If you have worked long enough, you already know something that younger professionals have not yet learned. Titles rise and fall. Hierarchies change shape. Companies reorganize with the seasons. What remains constant is the reputation you carry from one season to the next. It is forged quietly, through years of showing up even when no applause followed. It is strengthened through the decisions you made when no one else was willing to take responsibility. It grows in silence while others fight for visibility. And when the moment arrives where someone believes they can discard you without consequence, that reputation becomes your greatest asset. Your true power is not in an employer's approval. Employers, even well-intentioned ones, see only the value that fits their immediate needs. When those needs shift, their appreciation shifts with them. But trust is different. Trust is built in the shadows of long nights, in the patience required to solve problems that no one else has the courage to face, and in the steadiness you maintain when others panic. Trust is earned through presence, not position. It is your signature long before you write your name on any contract. If you have reached 50 or beyond, do not underestimate the advantage you possess. You have perspective. You understand cycles. You can see patterns forming long before others notice them. Young professionals may have energy, and they should be admired for it, but energy without understanding often leads to noise without progress. You have lived enough chapters to know what matters and what fades. That wisdom is not outdated. It is rare. And when people who lack it try to remove you, they reveal more about themselves than about you. The truth is simple. If someone fires you mid-sentence, make sure the right people heard what you were saying before the interruption. Because the people who matter in your professional life are not the ones who silence you. They are the ones who understand you without needing a full speech. Those are the individuals who follow your competence rather than your title. They recognize integrity even when others ignore it. And when the time comes, they will choose you over the institution that failed to appreciate you. You do not need a dramatic comeback story to prove your worth. You only need the quiet certainty that the work you did for decades has left an imprint. The clients who trust you. The colleagues who relied on you. The decisions shaped by your judgment. These cannot be removed from your history. They cannot be replaced by someone with a new diploma or a louder voice. If you are listening now, take this with you. Your value is not defined by the company you work for. It is defined by the way people speak your name when you are not in the room. Carry that with pride. Carry it with dignity. And if the moment ever arrives when someone ends your contribution abruptly, do not consider it the end of anything. Consider it the beginning of a chapter where you finally stand on the strength you built when no one was watching.